Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Could you all please take your seats?
Доброе утро, дамы и господа. Пожалуйста, занимайте свои места. Мы по-прежнему ждем еще двух участников нашей панельной дискуссии, в президиум. Позвольте представить, меня зовут Чарльз Tannock. Я член парламента уже 17 лет европейского, и я член...
I was one of the very first people to ever suggest in, I think, 2001, that Ukraine may have a European perspective ahead of it when I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. I had a letter to the Financial Times. It was considered quite revolutionary in those days, but little could I have known at the time that such events would have unfolded, whereby parts of Ukraine would have been outright annexed by a blatant act of aggression, and other parts would have been stirred up into a kind of proxy war generated from Moscow. So I think it's very timely and apposite that today we have this seminar and conference to look at the application and meaning of the sanctions that have been imposed against Russia and the wider aspects of EU-Russia relations and Russia's role in the world today, both in what it's doing in Ukraine, but in other parts, other theaters like in Syria. And I'd like to thank the Open Dialog Foundation, and particularly my colleague, who's actually, I mustn't speak too loudly because he's being interviewed, Petras Auštrevičius from the ALDE group, who sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee with me, whose idea it was. And I think just to, by way of some introductory remarks, the Russian sanctions are now coming up for renewal in just over 100 days, the sectoral sanctions at the end of January, which is why it's good to have this conference now to think about what that means. Certainly, I am concerned by the sad outcome to the referendum in my country, what Britain's departure from the European Union will mean in terms of weakening the pressure to maintain the sanctions, because I believe that my country was one of the protagonists in believing that that was the only language which Russia would understand in this respect. And then we have the separate sanctions later in June of 23rd of June on the issue of the annexation of Crimea, regarding Crimea itself. The sanctions, as you will remember, were imposed shortly after the annexation of Crimea in July of 2014. And in March of 2015, the Council linked these with economic restrictions to the complete implementation of the Minsk Agreements. One of the consequences has been asset freezes and visa bans applying to 149 persons, and 37 entities are subject to a freeze of all their assets held within the EU and any of its territories and the member states' territories. So although we will be talking about the sanctions, it's also important to think back about the blatant act of aggression which was in violation of all sorts of international norms and laws, from the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, to the Budapest Memorandum, which, of course, my country was a co-signatory, as it's done by the P5. And it really was a manifestation of many things that President Putin had said more than a decade ago, when none of us really in the West were listening. We thought he was bluffing. He made clear speeches about his revanchist, irredentist ambitions for Russia, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest disaster, but nobody really seriously thought that he would go as far as militarily and physically occupying territories of recognized sovereign states and violate their internationally recognized borders. But I'm afraid he did what he did, and clearly, sadly, so far, he's got away with it. And so we mustn't stop reminding ourselves that this behavior cannot be forgotten, and we cannot return, in my view, to business as usual with Russia. And so the Minsk protocols are there. It's a starting point for trying to negotiate. But we must also remember that 3,000 Ukrainian servicemen have lost their lives fighting to regain control of their country. we must remind ourselves of the horrendous cover-up, which was quite evident from the Dutch report, which was recently published on the downing of the MH17 aircraft, an appalling crime for which nobody has been punished and nobody has been brought to account. And it's perfectly clear to me, anyway, that Moscow will not allow those who did give the orders to be brought to justice. We must remind ourselves that only in September there was an appalling bombing of an aid convoy in Aleppo, where all the evidence is it was done by Russian and Syrian planes, which is protected under international law, an aid convoy bringing food to civilians in the rebel areas. Again, that would be a war crime in international law, bombing an aid convoy. So all these things should be, I think, uppermost in our minds when we think about the continuing applications of targeted economic sanctions against Russia. And we must also think about the fact that sanctions have been a useful tool and an effective tool in other parts of the world. I'm very much aware of the fact that next week we are voting in Strasbourg on the issue of EU-Iran relations. And if it weren't for the very strong sanctions applied by the US and the European Union, I doubt very much we'd be in a position to have brought Iran back to the negotiating table. And Iran, of course, is in this alliance with Russia in the Syrian theater, supporting the Assad regime. Yesterday, I met in the Foreign Affairs Committee Bureau meeting with Madame Mogherini, and I think there is a need to think of fresh initiatives as to how to put pressure on Russia. I raised the issue, particularly following this bombing of the aid convoy in Aleppo, which I believe is a war crime. How can the pressure be ratcheted up on Russia? And of course, one of the options might be to try and overcome their veto in the Security Council by looking at a resolution of the General Assembly under the Resolution 377, Uniting for Peace. So I think we need to think quite widely on how we can keep pressure up on Russia to rein it in, to stop behaving like a sort of rogue state, thinking that it can basically use military might to impose its will on the rest of the world. So those are my introductory remarks. We now have a range of very distinguished speakers who will be making their presentations. Our first intervention this morning is from Andrei Piontowski, who is a Russian scientist, writer, and political analyst. He's a member of the International Pen Club. He has a PhD in applied mathematics and is a member of the American Mathematical Society and has published widely in his areas of expertise. He was a director of the Strategic Studies Center in Moscow, which was closed in 2006. He contributes regularly online to all sorts of learned journals and as a regular commentator on the BBC World Service and Radio Liberty in Moscow. He has been an outspoken critic, and I love this line, of Putin's regime, who he has described as a hybrid fascist regime. I think that's an interesting term. I'd be interested to know what hybrid fascism means, but it sounds very apposite. Piontowski is the author of several books on Putin's presidency in Russia, including Another Look into Putin's Soul and Russian Identity. The floor is yours, Mr. Piontowski, Dr. Piontowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's okay with Mike. Well, to understand current controversy about Minsk Agreement, we should regard general strategy of Kremlin in this hybrid war against Ukraine. If hybrid fascism is my point, that hybrid war is a term invented by Chief of Russian General Staff, General Gerasimov. And what are the objective of this war? You mentioned, Mr. Chairman, in your introductory remark, that this imperial and revanchist nostalgia was characteristic for Russian political elite and for Mr. Putin personally long ago. But I don't think that it was the main driving force in aggression against Ukraine. Let's remember then in November 2013, when Mr. Putin successfully bribed and bullied Mr. Yanukovych in rejection of European Association Agreement, he was quite satisfied with the result and did not think about any Crimea annexation. Moreover, he tried to help Yanukovych government by loans and so on. The problem, number one, for Putin and for Kremlin to block any attempt of Ukraine to move on European trajectory of development. And they so fiercely opposed this very modest association agreement because in Putin's perception, this was the first step in Ukraine to change of game to rule, to Ukraine under Yanukovych was a clone of the same kleptocracy model in Putin model in Russia. And these models were typical for most of the post-Soviet space. And success story of European development to economic and political transparency of Ukraine would become an existential threat to Putin regime, because it would be appealing example for Russian population, because our two people are really very close by their history and their mentality. So the objective of Putin in Ukraine is not some part of Ukrainian territory. It's Ukraine as a whole, the soul, not territory, but soul of Ukraine, if you want. And annexation of Crimea was first step in this dismembering of new post-Maidan Ukraine. And after annexation of Crimea, Putin immediately put forward in euphoria, in post-Crimea euphoria, immediately put forward another objective, so-called Novorossiya, 10 or 12 Ukrainian region. And trying to inflame anti-Ukrainian rebellion there by attracting Russian population by idea of so-called Russian Ruski Mir, Russian vote. But Putin suffered a fundamental metaphysical defeat in Ukraine. The Russian-speaking, ethnic Russian in Ukraine, in their majority rejected this Nazist, fascist idea of Ruski vote. By the way, the Crimean triumphant speech Putin in Federal Assembly was so evidently was a remake of Hitler's speech in Reichstag after Sudeten annexation, that not me, not opponents of Putin, but one of the leading Kremlin propaganda officer, Mr. Migranyan, tried to somehow smooth this impression. He put forward a theory of good Hitler. There were two Hitler. A good Hitler fighting for national interests until 1939, and then maybe when he invaded Soviet Union, he became bad Hitler. So he presented the theory of Putin as a good Hitler. Well, the idea of this good Hitler failed because it was rejected, first of all, by ethnic Russian. And Putin could grab only a small part of two Ukrainian region, Donetsk and Lugansk. And now he changed the tactic. The objective stayed the same, undermining on Ukraine, blocking Ukrainian way to Europe. And now, when he realized that it is impossible to solve this problem by military means, he wants to do it by political means. exploiting and trying to use the efforts, peacekeeping efforts of France in Germany. His idea now is to push, to seduce Ukraine by illusion of restoration its territorial integrity, without Crimea, of course. Push these occupied territories as a cancer tumor into the political body of Ukraine. Make these bandits like somebody named Motorola, who was blown up 2 days ago, make them respectable political figures of Ukraine, members of Rada, members of Executive Party, and by this way, from inside, blocking the political and economic development of Ukraine. This, his interpretation of Minsk Agreement is subordinated to this objective. On the evening of signing of Minsk Agreement, my friend Mr. Illarionov, who present here, and we'll talk in the second panel, and me published an article about this agreement. We appreciated very highly the one provision of this agreement, ceasefire, line of division. It's stop further territorial expansion of Kremlin aggression, and it saved lives. But all we at that same evening we noted underscored in our article that another provision are not realizable. Kremlin took two obligations: withdrawing troops, or rather the provision was formulated withdrawing of foreign troops without actually mentioning Russia. And until very recently, Kremlin denied the presence of Russian troops, but several days ago Putin for the first time confessed it, saying that, yes, we were bound to send the troops to protect Russian-speaking population, and returning control on the Ukrainian-Russian border to Ukrainian authority. Kremlin will never fulfill this provision because they will undermine the objective I mentioned. Their objective is to undermine Ukrainian state and block its development through this cancer tumor which they wanted to insert into Ukrainian political border. And from Ukrainian demands from Ukrainian side was changing of their constitution, which is legally null and void, by the way, because Constitution of Ukraine is a text of a higher legal statute than Minsk Protocol. Mr. Poroshenko, not a dictator of the country, he's a president, and he can't took obligation to change his constitution. He may took obligation to present some draft on changing to Ukrainian parliament and not more. And the second demand, which now is repeated again and again, elections in occupied territory. But this territory under full control of Russian troops or Russian surrogates, like these so-called volunteers like Motorola, Girkin, and others who came from different parts of Russia. This election would be even worse version than referendum in Crimea under forced pressure of Russian troops. So my opinion is that if France and Germany want to be so constructive in peacekeeping, it would be better if they concentrated on main positive provision of this agreement, ceasefire and division of forces of this new line. But all information from OSCE and other sources confirm that exchange of fire are provoked in most cases from the Kremlin side. And this is the essence, by the way, of two latest PASE resolution, which support very clearly Ukrainian position. You may say that what I am advocating for is a freezing of the conflict. Yes, but freezing of conflict, if there will be no exchange of fire, if there will be no deaths from Ukrainian side, from separatist sides, it would be much better than what Moscow want to impose on Ukraine, and what Ukraine will never agree with. I hope that this approach will be articulated on the meeting of summit of Norman Group, which is, by the way, symbolically is going on just now in these minutes while we discussing the problem here, several hundred kilometers here in Berlin. Leaders of the state continued their discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pionkowski. I would like to say that so other speakers are hopefully also contributing to the real situation, to give us a perspective on the real situation on the ground in east of Ukraine, because I think to judge our diplomatic efforts, also in the context of the meeting today in Berlin, to judge the successes of our diplomatic efforts, it's really important to understand whether the most important target of the Minsk Agreements has been achieved. And this meant always to stop the fighting, to stop the killing, and to achieve the withdrawal of weapons from the territory, especially the Russian weapons from the territory. I had the opportunity, together with two colleagues from the European Parliament, one is already here, Michał Boni, and our colleague Stetina, to visit the contact line and to speak to people who are living with ongoing shelling nearly every day in Marinka. And so to face the reality on the ground is very important to judge what we have achieved and what we have not achieved. And so for me, this reality check really meant that we cannot continue with watching the implementation of Minsk Agreement as we did for a long time, but we have also to interfere in our national context, especially in France and in Germany, to get more influence on what they are discussing. I have now the pleasure to introduce Anastasia Kirilenko. She is a very experienced investigative journalist with experiences not only in east of Ukraine, but also in the Caucasus and in Georgia. So with probably more insight on problematic developments in frozen conflicts, but also in the war zone in east of Ukraine. Please, Anastasia.
Thank you for the introduction, indeed, and probably I have some insight also as for diplomacy. We don't know yet the outcome of the negotiations today, but yesterday the foreign minister of France already said the main goal is to put pressure on Ukraine to develop this particular status of Donbass, etc. It's for me, it's an obvious mistake. Recently, French press also revealed how the so-called Ministry of Information of DNR or Donbass, they made fake videos to accuse Ukraine of violations of ceasefire. It means people dressed on Ukrainian uniform on purpose pretended to violate ceasefire. So the context of this normal negotiations is very interesting, I would say. But I'd like to give you also some features as for previous peace agreements of the hybrid conflicts. I mean, first of all, Georgia and also Transnistria. During negotiations with Georgia, Nicolas Sarkozy put pressure also only on Georgia. I was totally astonished when I learned the details from the insiders. For example, he was saying, come on, I have no much time. I have to go back to my family in France. And come on, you have only this option. Where are your Americans that support you? Are they hiding under this table of negotiation? So he was somehow abusive. As you probably remember, presidents of Poland, Lech Kaczynski, and also presidents of Baltic states came to Georgia physically to go in Tbilisi on the central square. And Nicolas Sarkozy was asked to do so also, but he said, I can't, it's to remain neutral, I can't do it. And I remember also well the climate after 2008. European diplomats were saying that Russia won't aggress anybody again. Now it's funny to think about it. Also, what was interesting in Georgia's case, Russian side tried to falsify already signed agreements during the translation. It means, for example, there was a sentence that there was a need to provide security guarantees in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And Russians pretended it was security guarantees of Abkhazia and South Ossetia that allowed them to recognize those so-called states. Or, for example, they translated not remove troops, but just move troops. And the same was happening also in Minsk. French diplomats checked twice or thrice the agreements to avoid at least these fake translations. And indeed, Russians tried to translate in a creative manner the original documents. So why the long-term peace process fails? It's of course because there are no legitimate representatives of people of Donbass or whatever, of Georgia, among those rebels. As for South Ossetia, now the majority of the population left, and the so-called ministers of this republic come from Russia, from small towns in Ural, or even from Belarus. So about what republic you can speak. And then the same with Donbass. Yes, it's a hybrid war. First of all, Ukrainians were accused of fascism. It is exactly the same like with Georgia or with Transnistria. Then there is no demarcation. Mr. Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, said demarcation is the case of both sides, and Russia does not need it now. So, amid such circumstance, French and German diplomats want to put pressure on Ukraine. Of course, it's astonishing. I would finish on a somehow positive note to give some recommendations. First of all, it's important for European diplomats to stop saying we won't fight for Ukraine. For example, American former ambassador Mr. Michael McFaul said it publicly, but many European diplomats say it off on the record that we won't fight for Ukraine. But you know, it's like a carte blanche for Putin. At least you can think it, but not to say it publicly. And then, of course, it's important to keep principles. I mean, what is going on now, it's even very bad for Russian society. Because of this war in Ukraine, Russian situation with freedoms dramatically changed. There is a criminal article on the so-called separatism, and activists who supported Crimean Tatars already went in jail, and so on and so on. But I know that diplomats still consider Russia as a regional power, important partner, that negotiation is better than nothing, etc. This is despite all the violations of aggression, violations of human rights inside Russia, and so on. So long term, this approach will fail, I suppose. For example, Angela Merkel said that it is important to keep negotiation with Russia, but with people who are conducting the hybrid war, they can violate the already signed agreements. So negotiation should be based on certain principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And maybe I forgot to say our panelist is a journalist from Russia. So she's not from Ukraine, she's from Russia. So,
in spite of a Ukrainian name, sounds very Ukrainian, Kirilenko. The name must be Ukrainian.
Yeah, but I have a Russian passport.
Yeah, but so also in the European Parliament is important, I think, always to underline that talking about Ukraine, talking about Donbass, or talking about other situations of conflicts and warlike situations with Russia, is important that we have also Russian speakers who share the concerns of the Ukrainians. So the next speaker is an experienced diplomat, Mr. Makeyev from Ukraine, and he is following closely, I would say, the Minsk Agreements from the preparation to the first failure, to the next failure, and until today. Please, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is an honor for me to have this very opportunity to talk to you on Minsk Agreements. Not just because Minsk Agreements are important for Ukraine and for Europe, not just because Minsk Agreements are important for reaching peace in Ukraine. They are important for the people of Ukraine who are suffering from this warfare. And they are important for me personally. And let me begin with something very, very personal. Since the beginning of Russian aggression in February 2014, I start my every morning by reading from my smartphone the reports from the front line. And what I see 2.5 years after the Russian aggression started, and 2 years after Russia and Minsk agreed to cease the fire and to withdraw troops. I see figures. Some last figures from our army and the figures from the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission about the number of shellings. 60 shellings a day, 120 shellings a day. From the night of October 12 to October 13, we had more than 800 artillery rounds hitting our positions in the southern flank of the front line. But what strikes me are names. Lieutenant Maxim M., born 1989, killed in action, artillery shelling. Corporal Oleg K., born 77, severe injuries, died on the way to hospital. Private Oleg K., 87, mine explosion. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 3,020 our guys lost in the 2.5 years of this war. We have more than 10,000 people killed. Only this year, we lost 173 our guys. Is that a ceasefire? No. Russia is conducting a real war in Ukraine, a war at the gates of Europe in the 21st century. And I believe what our soldiers are doing, they are protecting not only Ukraine, they are protecting not only me and my family, they protected Europeans from spreading that aggression. What we diplomats can do is to use all diplomatic and political means to urge Russia to pull back. And this is why those Minsk agreements are important for Ukraine and for Europe. So what has been agreed in Minsk? I know it perfectly well because I spent those famous 16 hours long night in Minsk in the team supporting my president in bringing peace back to Ukraine. So what my president and the federal chancellor wanted to achieve that night is to silence the guns, to withdraw heavy weapons from the front line, to withdraw Russian troops from Ukraine and disarm illegal armed formation, to return all detainees and prisoners, and to start the political process, and to start the reconciliation and deoccupation of Ukraine. This is what we agreed in Minsk. And every single paragraph, every single word and letter was also agreed by the President of Russian Federation. What Ukraine did to implement this agreement? On security track, we observed the ceasefire. We properly fulfill our obligations regarding withdrawal of weaponry from the touchline, and we support and guarantee full access to the monitors of the Special Monitoring Mission in the areas under our control. On the political track, we adopted the special order of local self-government in certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. We scheduled the date for legitimate local elections, which was undermined by Russia, and Russians held their sham elections back in 2014. We adopted amendments to the Constitution on decentralization in the first reading. We worked out the concept of the law on local elections in Donbass. What did Russia do? So far, Russia has implemented nothing. When Ukrainian, French, and German delegation left Minsk on that evening back in February 12, 2015, Russia immediately launched a final offensive to capture the city of Debaltseve, which was surrounded then. Since then, Russia has pumped the Donbass, placing there over 6,000 regular troops, over 30,000 mercenaries, arming them with hundreds of tanks, over 1,000 artillery systems, and multiple launch rocket systems. What we are facing right now is the army, which is better equipped than major European armies. This is the fact. Do we have a way out? Yes. I'm here to say that Ukraine is fully committed to implement the Minsk agreements. But Russia needs to deliver on its obligation as well. They must cease the fire, they must get their troops out of Ukraine, and let the OSCE monitor the situation in the whole occupied territory of Donbass, including the border, the 409 kilometers of the Russian-Ukrainian border, which is not under control of Ukraine, to testify that no Russian troops are in Ukraine anymore, no Russian armaments are being brought to Ukraine through the border, and that the permissive environment is created to hold a free and fair elections according to OSCE standards. How can we, as diplomats, MAPs, politicians, civil servants, achieve this? You would say with usual civilized Western approach, by power of persuasion, by talking softly. And the old African saying tells us, talk softly, but carry a stick. Talking softly with Russia alone, however, leads nowhere, and we know that. History tells us that Russia only respects power. Talk without stick generally doesn't work with Russia. And the only stick we have in game today is the current sanctions regime. And make no mistake, the sanctions are very painful and hard in Russia. And Russia very much wants to get rid of that. But they cannot be removed, not until such time as Russia implements Minsk and begins behaving in a civilized and decent manner in so many areas. And not only in Ukraine. What about Syria? What about its own country, where the real fight against human rights has begun? And I completely agree with what you, Andriy, told us about analysis of the Minsk Agreement back then on February 12th. So that night, I was coming back from Minsk, just falling asleep for for 1 hour in a plane, but knowing that we agreed about the ceasefire. And starting from February 15, we're gonna have a real ceasefire and nobody will be killed anymore. Where are we now? It's not the October 19, 2016. We're still in February 12, 2015. Because Russia clearly shows that it's not just having a hybrid warfare in Ukraine. It understands ceasefire as something also hybrid. Let's see the hybrid ceasefire in Syria. Let's see of the way how Russia concludes the agreements and hybridly implement those agreements. And even I completely agree, and I can confirm what you said, Anastasia, and even hybrid translation of the documents is the way how Russia negotiates. So once again, I think the Minsk Agreement are compelled as a clear logic of steps to be implemented. If everybody wants to make it work and everybody wants to implement. Unfortunately, we clearly see that Russia doesn't recognize those Minsk Agreements and doesn't want to implement it. So once again, all the elements of political pressure, sanctioning Russia and using that instrument wisely is the way how we can urge Russian Federation to behave in a more civilized manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei. And I think for us it's very important to discuss on the Minsk Agreements and to discuss on the sanctions, and to never forget that we never ever achieved a binding link in between the regime of sanctions and the Minsk Agreement. We tried from the side of the European Parliament very often before those summits where heads of states came to Brussels to decide on Minsk and on sanctions, to evaluate Minsk and to discuss on sanctions, but we never ever achieved this binding link. And When we now follow the situation before the meeting of the heads of states in the Normandy format in Berlin, there is again a doubtful, partly doubtful discussion on whether sanctions, economic and personalized sanctions, can work. I think this is a big mistake, be it on Minsk or be it on possible decisions on Aleppo. The weakness of the concept of sanctions, the weakness comes from the doubts always immediately in the discussion after an agreement on sanctions has been taken. So the European Union must be much more consistent on economic sanctions if they, in the future, from now on, want to use their economic power to strengthen their diplomatic efforts. So one of those persons who really is experienced on observing the results of diplomatic efforts is Mr. Hook. I think most of us here in the European Parliament have met Alexander Hook often in his function as one of the leaders of the Special Observation Mission to Ukraine by OSCE. And he and his people, I think, in spite of the fact that they are often criticized, they deliver also the fundament for us to judge on does Minsk work or is Minsk ignored? Please, Alexander.
Thank you very much for this introductory words for me and the appreciation of the work of myself and my colleagues. I will convey that back to Ukraine, and I'm sure the monitors will appreciate that. Thank you also for having us here today. I'm a monitor as my 700 colleagues in Ukraine, and as such I will try to provide you first some background into the Minsk process and then some facts at the end of that, the objective facts that we monitor on the ground. What you see in front of you here first is also starting there where my colleague Oleksiy has started, is the fate of the civilians. You see here that infamous bridge in the Luhansk region, the Stanica Luhanska bridge, the only official crossing in the Luhansk region where civilians can only cross on foot over this wooden provisional ridge there across the Severodonetsk River. And not only that, you see on top of that bridge positions on both sides of the river. The sides have dug themselves in and are very close to each other. And not only is it a passage, but it's also a battlefield at the same time. Next slide, please. Just looking back in time again, and it's important here that you see the actual signatures there down on the documents. Not all of these documents have been made public, as you know. Unfortunately, some of the Minsk agreements, of the many, are not public. And as you know, secret documents are very difficult to verify because nobody knows what actually has been agreed. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission tries to do and fill the gap with its monitoring activity to see what type of deliveries are being visible on the field. Of the first three important documents there, but then also next slide on the following documents that had been agreed, starting from the addendum that regulated the withdrawal of other proscribed weapons, the tanks and smaller caliber weapons, through to the latest agreement on the 21st of September agreed on disengagement along the contact line, including in areas such as that bridge that you have seen at the beginning here of the presentation there. Now, there are lots of stakeholders, next slide please, that are involved here. Here I tried to build up the universe within which we try to support the implementation of Minsk. You see there the SMM surrounded by its participating states, of which we are the tool of, the participating states there, one of which is the chair, which is Germany at the moment, and the Conflict Prevention Center. You see the Normandy 4 group there. At the right corner, or the left corner, you see the Trilateral Contact Group with its working groups. You see the government of Ukraine, of course, with its own authorities. And then you have the so-called LPR and so-called LPR there, as well as a stakeholder in this game. And importantly as well, the Joint Center for Control and Coordination, as well as, of course, the media. All of those actors have a role in trying to bring about a solution. The role of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission is that to document whether or not commitments taken by all of these stakeholders there are being implemented. Next slide, please. The contested issues here, as you are aware, with the implementation of Minsk, is the big question as to what comes first, the security question or the political question that has not been resolved. Format issues are also a question. What is the trilateral contact group? Is it a trilateral group, or in fact, as some of the agreements suggest, are there also participants of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk represented? These are issues that have not been solved yet and require further discussion. The role of the SMM, next slide please, here, next slide, is that of documenting the implementation of Minsk. Now at the moment we have 14 permanent presences along the line of contact, on both lines of the contact. You see here the line yellow and our presence with the circles there indicated. At the moment there are 600 monitors distributed across these 14 locations, and from out of these locations the monitors operate during daytime on moving patrols and statically during nighttime, opposite some journalists that claim we only work during banking hours. They work throughout the night and observe also statically from these positions where they currently are, or are at the receiving end of technology that we have put in place. Next slide, please. Important also, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission is not a Minsk mission. It has not been created by Minsk. The Permanent Council of the OSCE, the 57 participating states, have put the mission on the ground on the 21st of March 2014, before the open conflict in the eastern part of the country. The task we undertake in the framework of that Permanent Council decision, not dictated by Minsk. We support Minsk, we have a supporting role, and in that we are an information-driven field operation of the 57 participating states. Next slide, please. We, of course, are often hindered in our work, that has been already mentioned here. These are security threats in particular, and you will see a vast majority of those, looking back in time, occurred in areas not controlled by the government. And one anecdote that I always bring here, just to bring you also the reality into the room here, is when I once drove up at a checkpoint in areas not controlled by the government in the Donetsk region, an armed man there stopped us and said, "You can't go further here any longer." And I told the man, very friendly, it's our mandate and the Minsk Agreements that allow us to move here freely, and our freedom of movement is unqualified. And that man with his gun said, "I'm very sorry, Minsk has no say here. Here reigns Mr. Kalashnikov," and was tapping on his gun. And that is why Mr. Kalashnikov also made it there in the presentation. But this is the reality on the ground. The Minsk Agreements, the papers that I've shown you in before, have been signed by the Russian Federation, by Ukraine, by Mr. Plotnitsky and Mr. Sakarchenko. But when you then go onto the ground, and our patrols face it on a daily basis, they will see that the military logic still reigns the theater, where the civil logic included in the Minsk Agreements should be put in place a long time ago. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, looking back in time, facts here now to present to you. Almost 70% of all movement restrictions measured between April and mid of October occurred in areas not controlled by the government. So the far more majority of our movement restrictions there occur in areas where the government does not control. Why I put this first is because here we have direct evidence which of the signatories of the Minsk Agreements do fulfill their obligations, to what degree. These are facts, undisputable, because we drive up to these checkpoints and we know who stops us. There we have no doubt in terms of the accuracy and the factual objectivity of these facts here in front of you. Next slide, please. Now, another fact is the following one. Here you see the ceasefire violations on both sides of the contact line observed by the mission, measured up to the end of August. You see there where the grayish arrow starts. That was the night when the signatories, including the Russian Federation and those of the certain regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, and the Ukrainian government, has recommitted to the ceasefire. And what is important here, you see the thousands of violations, and then overnight to almost zero. Now, if anything has to be proven that the sites are able to control the 500-kilometer contact line, you have it in front of you. We have documented it, in fact, that there is no problem to stop the conflict overnight. Not, of course, what is tragic with that fact is, next slide, that equally you can turn it off again. Now, these are the weeks after that relative silence up to this day, and we are back to almost thousands of violations, and my colleague Oleksiy there has already lined out. Just last week, on Friday, our observer mission has registered 850 explosions in total in the Donetsk region, over 600 of those in the southern part of the Donetsk region. That is, of course, as you can see now, a question rather of will than of control and command at the contact line. That is very important. That is not a conclusion, it is not a speculation, it's a fact. If you go back a slide, you can see here once again, we had thousands of violations at the end of August, and overnight it drops after a recommitment in Minsk to 0. Next slide. And next slide. Here just a brief other mapping. Of course, these violations occur in geographically concentrated areas. Here you have the different known hotspots on top, the triangle between the infamous airport, of which you have the air tower as the logo of your meeting today, the Yasinovata and government-controlled Avdiivka, the top of the paragraphs there. It is easier, next slide, to look at a heat map. This compares now the current week with the past week, and you can see the red dots on that map. This is measured at the amounts of ceasefire violations that we register. You can see even from a distance, the vast majority of those occur in the Donetsk region, and you can see, and it confirms what Oleksiy here from the Foreign Ministry said, that down south in the Donetsk region at the moment we see a rapid deterioration there, where a small circle was the week before, and now that red dot there has increased significantly. Next slide, please. Now, what is important also to mention here, once again, and it has also been already addressed by some of my panel colleagues here, is that the Minsk agreements have to be looked at as a full package. It is not sufficient just to look at one of the agreements. All of them require implementation. The latest, the disengagement decision, will not work if not the heavy weapons are withdrawn. And if the heavy weapons are not withdrawn, it is absolutely clear that the military and the armed formations will not move. Those weapons must be withdrawn before any other action can happen. Nobody will withdraw under the threat of artillery fire, and nobody will naturally withdraw under fire. Next slide, please. That brings me to the point that also was of interest, I understood, to the audience, the withdrawal of weapons. Good readers of our reports know that these weapons on both sides of the line have not been pulled out of the zones where they shouldn't be. We still see tanks, we see artillery systems, and we see multi-launch rocket systems on both sides of the lines in areas where they shouldn't be. And what is more, next slide, we also see them in use. Here you see the usage of proscribed weapons of Minsk on both sides of the line. And tragically here, at the end of that scale, which is the present time, you can see a spike in the use of artillery again. These weapons shouldn't be there, and of course should not be used. All of these columns that you have in front of you, and the green and yellow ones before, should be down to 0. Only that is normal. And that is another point that our reports make very clear. The normal situation was or is when Minsk is fully implemented, when those violations are to 0. We should not accept a new reality that is in front of you. This is not normal. It is not normal to have 800 explosions of artillery devices registered by the SMM. It is not normal. Normal is 0 violations. Next slide. Here, just a short video clip to give you a bit more reality of what it means in terms of having these weapons there. This is this triangle there. You see impacts of mortars around this zone between Avdiivka and Yasinovata, taken by one of our long-range UAVs there flying over in that area, documenting the usage of heavy weapons. And this should put anything beyond doubt that these weapons are still there. Here, outgoing fire, this flashes, symbolizes outgoing fire of artillery, 82 millimeter position here. Once again, outgoing fire there. You can even see those handling the weapons. in that specific position. And all of that is documented in our reports every day. Impact of heavy artillery here on that very contact line, and here once again a heavy impact that is now here documented by our UAV. Next slide, please. You can also see here standstill pictures, and I've said we see it on both sides of the line. I just want to put evidence to that. Here you see 152 millimeter, that's very heavy artillery pieces in areas controlled by the so-called DPR, in areas where they shouldn't be, in firing position, with hot barrels just being used and fired. Next slide. On this side, this is a Ukrainian position where we have also documented a possible 122 millimeter mortar position, also in areas where guns should not be. Next slide. Of course, our technology as well as our patrols are often interfered with. Here is the evidence, if you have not had any doubt, taken also by our UAVs, a sophisticated electronic jamming system deployed by the so-called DPR. Here, obviously not plugged in, otherwise we couldn't have taken the shot that is there. And it's not one time we have seen it multiple times across the contact line. Next slide. Not only are they interfered with, they're also shot down from the skies. Here, also a picture that we have made public, it is known. This is the last picture one of our long-range UAV has taken. You see there a surface-to-air missile system aiming at our UAV. You can see the barrel in the middle, aiming at the camera itself, and this was one of the last pictures taken. The surface-to-air missile system was positioned in areas controlled by the so-called DPR. Next slide, please. Just a few words on disengagement, the last decision there. Next slide. Why this is important? Because it helps to prevent skirmishes. You have seen on the line of contact on the Donetsk region mainly, the fighting is still taking place. That is where the sites sit on top of each other. In that area where you have seen the aerial surveillance picture, the sites are as close as 50 meters against each other, and that is where disengagement would be needed to prevent the continuation of fighting. It also can prevent the accidental attacks. I have witnessed myself that with one side is demining, the other side, if it is not coordinated and they're so close, they believe they're under an imminent mortar attack and they open fire, and you have a skirmish that can develop into long-lasting battles. That can only happen, of course, if it's done in equal terms on both sides, and it can only happen in the context of the implementation of the other agreements. If heavy weapons are sitting behind those withdrawal lines for disengagement, it will not happen. And we have shown you here, and we report 6 days a week, that these weapons are still there where they should not be. Next slide, please. Here are the 3 areas, 2 of which have delivered some success. 1 is still pending. And unfortunately, it's that area where civilians mostly would need it, at that bridge in Stanica Luhanska there in the Luhansk region. Next slide. Just to give you a reason of the difficulties here, that is the Stanica Luhanska disengagement area. The green area is that road that leads across that bridge. That is where the SMM has access. All the other red roads, the spaghettis on that map there, are the areas where we have no access. The SMM can only do as good as work as the sites permitted to do, and you can see here that we only have very limited access to that disengagement area. That prevents us from verifying, which is an altogether different job than monitoring. Next slide. That brings me to an end here, and as my colleagues sure, I'm available for any questions there might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, and I can only underline how important it is that we get those observation results, whatever the disappointment on Minsk or the ceasefire that doesn't work is. We need these informations. I would like to add from my personal experience, and probably Michał Boni will talk later also about this. So all those figures mean that in places like Marinka, you have villages, you have citizens, you have children with their families. They are getting used to live with war. They are getting used to spend parts of their life, sometimes whole weeks, in their shelter underground. children who go to school, they are getting used to check whether there is sniper activity or whether they can safely go and leave their homes and go to school. So it's, the figures are only one side. The reality of normal citizens who really hope that we have more successes to get a real ceasefire should not be forgotten behind this. And I think the frustration in these territories along the contact line, the frustration among the citizens on European diplomacy is really something everybody should be confronted with. When we went to the contact line with the colleagues from European Parliament and Verkhovna Rada, it was very interesting because there everybody knew that 3 days before, 2 ministers, Hérault from France and Steinmeier from Germany, had visited the same, more or less the same places. And for this visit, Moscow had guaranteed a ceasefire, a safe situation. This information was published by the German Ministry for Foreign Affairs. So if there is a will in Moscow to have a ceasefire, then it can happen. So, colleagues, guests, we have some time for questions to our panelists, and I saw already one colleague. No, in the first row, you wanted to ask a question? Yeah.
Say who they are first.
Yeah, please introduce.
Yeah, can you introduce yourselves?
You first, Charles?
You.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca. And dear colleagues, I not only welcome the event, but I will suggest this hearing to be done in AFET or AFET plus SEDE, because after listening to the speakers and the very dramatic evidences they produced today, I have the strange feeling that the Normandia format is unaware about the facts. Because if you are aware about the facts, you should not deliver statements telling that we shall put the pressure on Ukraine. At least you should be cautious, you should be balanced, and you should look to the facts. The second, I'm not surprised by the facts I heard today, because we knew it's a déjà vu which it's repeating and repeating again, time and again, but very few people, the decision makers, are here or ready to accept that. And this is the problem with the credibility of our union. And the third, after listening to the speakers, it's evidently true today that the war, the explicit occupation of Crimea and then the de facto occupation of eastern Ukraine, it's a gradual implementation of a strategy which started early, and then it was moving towards the frozen conflicts, which can be activated or deactivated by Moscow at any moment in time when decide to do so. And one final remark, which I read quite a lot, but it's equally evidently that now, after the completely outside the Ukrainian control border with Russia, they would like to have a big exclusive say on eastern Ukraine so that they to have the veto power in Kiev. It's Europe willing to do that. It's Europe ready to sacrifice our basics in order to allow Russia to have a final say on Kiev without manu militare, because if so, then we shall let pressure Ukraine. If we are willing about the facts you just displayed here, we should be cautious and we should be balanced in order to put pressure to make sure that the implementation of the Minsk Agreement, it's a binding factor on both sides, not in one side. And my final conclusion after listening to Mr. Haag, how to believe that from moving from voluntary and volunteers and the Green Army and no insignia in eastern Ukraine, we are having now hundreds of tanks, huge accumulation of heavy weaponry, very sophisticated weaponries which cannot be allowed or afforded for a normal EU member state. How many member states today in Europe, within our union, are in the position to own hundreds of operational tanks, good operational tanks? If this is not a joke, then I will conclude, thanking once again for this event, I will conclude by reiterating the idea of having a serious hearing in AFET and SEDE jointly, because this is a problem to be discussed. And then do not forget that the Grozny strategy in Aleppo is just the next step.
Yeah.
And the only question today is not whether it will be a new episode soon. The only problem is where and who will be the next. If we are not ready to answer this question, everything else is just our stupid readiness to buy utopia and then not to see the facts. Thank you so much.
Alexander, do you want to comment on the weapons situation, like it has been described?
I would like to comment on the question of facts. I would just like to remind you that our reports and all of what I've said is in the public domain ever since the beginning, are available on our website in 3 languages, 6 days a week. Ever since the mission has started, over 700 of those reports have been published, and that is the information based on which I hope those who have to make the decision to bring this to a conclusion can rely on, because that is the fact that the mission has seen. It is not the entire reality, because we are not everywhere, but these are the facts that the observers, those 600 that I have mentioned before, are there on the ground. Thank you.
Petras Auštrevičius.
Thank you, Rebecca. My question goes to Anastasia and to Andrei. In fact, to what extent Putin's regime is successful in selling the story which is going on in Donetsk for the time of being? Because it's not just the economic and financial burden on the Russian budget, but as well as military. I mean, there are victims. I mean, coffins arrive to Russia. I mean, population is sensitive towards victims and those who are killed on the battlefield. To what extent, I mean, I know that Crimea is already not so successful story in Russia anymore, because people who suffered a lot of economic decline, they are not really buying that story as well. We supported Crimeans and everything is fine. I mean, because the corruption stories pop out, and it is not easy, I mean, to convince people that everything is so fine in Crimea. But to what extent official line is able to control the situation in what is going on in Donetsk and region, and to what extent Putin's strategy probably is changing in this regard?
Okay, I think it's nobody asks now Ukrainians how do they feel about the Russian power. Nobody asks Chechen people, and also on Donbass. What is important is to create Potemkin village. I remember even in 2014, Russians have somehow promised to Crimea, you will live like in Chechnya, because have you seen, it's now a paradise. And yesterday, I think Russian embassy's Twitter in the United States, they published photos of Chechnya pretending it's peaceful paradise and so on. Of course, it's not true. But Russia is not a democracy. Media are controlled by personal Putin's friends, and unfortunately, many people, or they believe, or they somehow understand, but they fear. They're afraid to think something against Putin. What is a pity for me, even in Europe, the coverage of the conflict in Ukraine is hybrid. As I come from media, I know that sometimes special correspondents were sent in Ukraine, and they went back, for example, to France, to Germany. They said, we saw evidence that it was created by Russia, only by Russia, this conflict. But the editor-in-chief is against conspiracy. He is saying, please, can you put the second side and the second opinion to create unbiased report, and so on. So now we have some novel investigations, but it's too late. It's 2 years later.
Crimean annexation initially was more or less successfully sought by Russian population. I don't know exactly figures. Nobody knows its sociology, its non-existence in authoritarian society. But I think that maybe more than a half of population initially accepted this is a positive news. First of all, no life was lost, and the history of this territory is rather confused and complicated. Some period it belonged to Russian Federation, some period to... But Donbass and Lugansk was absolutely a different story. I already mentioned in the beginning that most fundamental metaphysical defeat of Putin in Ukraine with ethnic Russian in Ukraine did not support idea of Russian mir, and majority of Russian people also did not support idea of Russian mir, and there is no readiness to fight for new territories for Novorossiya or other parts of former Soviet Union. The most secret information in Russian Federation was casualties in Donbass. People were arrested for publishing this information because it was absolutely unpopular. And it became evident that full-scale war with Ukraine will not be accepted by Russian society. This makes Putin to look for another way of controlling Ukraine, not military extent, but such sophisticated use of this occupied territory to put, as our colleague expressed it, to put a veto of all Ukrainian decision.
I have also one from the audience.
Just on the issue of the casualties, you mentioned a figure of 10,000 lives lost and 3,200 Ukrainian service armed forces personnel. Do we have any figures at all on the Russian side what the military losses have been? You hear stories about body bags and suppression and arrests, but do you have any idea what sort of military scale they've suffered?
Nobody knows exactly.
Does the Ukrainian government have any views?
This is a state secret in Russian Federation. It's forbidden to publish this
There must be some
information.
guesses on your government side.
Well,
sustained.
I'm not ready now to give you any figures on that. But the number of Russian officers and regulars detained by Ukraine and brought back to Russia or exchanged, for example, for Nadia Savchenko and for two other political prisoners is once again the fact that they are there. What the other mission, not the special monitoring mission, but the observer mission of the OSCE, which is placed on two border crossings on the Russian side of the border, reports that they see the trucks bringing corps of soldiers fallen onto that territory into the territory of the Russian Federation. And of course here the importance of NGOs is there, because only the non-governmental organization can raise the awareness of the Russian people that something is wrong with this government sending its soldiers to another country and bringing them back killed in action and buried secretly somewhere in Russia.
But I think it was a clear sign about the fact that the Russian government and Russian leadership know about that Russian society is not ready to go to war in Ukraine. It was a clear signal for this when the Duma decided on the law which has forbidden to communicate on losses of soldiers, Russian soldiers on Ukrainian territory. We have one more question and then we have to conclude.
Yeah. Agency for Euro-Atlantic. Rebecca, thank you. Mr. Piontkowski mentioned that I'm here. Mr. Piontkowski mentions that Poroshenko is not dictator and he cannot dictate to accept any decisions concerning the changing in the constitution. And from another side, we have seen last week the speech of Mr. Hollande in Strasbourg, when he told the first should be elections on the Donbas region and afterwards control of the territory. My question is for all members of European Parliament. Tomorrow would be the summit of EU and probably it's possible to see Madame Merkel and Mr. Hollande, and to send the message not to push, not to make pressure on Poroshenko to protect him, not to make any illegal, even illegal steps to make changes for the constitution. How you can comment this? Who can do it? You know, this evening would be meeting.
Not to me, but it's rather a call, appeal to the members of parliament. But I want to make one comment about behavior statement of French Foreign Minister, Mr. Roh. As you know, Mr. Roh initiated personally, and he was supported by his president, Hollande, initiated investigation of International Criminal Court of war crimes of Syria and Russian Federation in Aleppo. So in his perception, Mr. Putin, Mr. Shoigu, and Mr. Lavrov is war criminals when he regards the Syria situation. But when Mr. Roh returns to Ukrainian situation, he perceives the same persons as respectable partners in mediating Ukrainian conflict. But it's the same person. They behave the same mentality. They behave the same way both in Ukraine and in Syria. So Mr. French, Foreign Minister of French Republic, to put it mildly, suffering from a kind of cognitive dissonance, I think.
Maybe to conclude, just one word. Thank you very much. Just to conclude with one word, very discussed question, elections in the illegally occupied Donbass now or when, we have a standing invitation to all political groups represented here at the panel. We have a number of Ukrainian politicians who would be ready to go for elections in Donbass, for local elections. So standing invitation for all the political groups in the European Parliament. Please be brave and accompany our Ukrainian politicians to go and start campaign in the city of Donetsk, in the city of Lugansk, in Horlivka. Just on Sunday, just pull the tent, raise Ukrainian flag, and talk to the people. Vote for me because I'm for united Ukraine. Please vote for me. Can you imagine that after listening to Mr. Hook, after listening to what is happening now in Ukraine? I don't think so. But I do like that it happens as soon as possible, because the elections, free and fair elections, according to OSCE standards, it's about democracy. I want my Donbass to be brought back to Ukraine as a part of democratic Ukraine and not autocratic Russia. Thank you.
I was going to make a political comment because you addressed your comments, I think, to the parliamentarians, the politicians, and I think that it is a sad fact that we are now living in an era of what I call post-facts, post-truth politics, where the facts don't seem to count very much. And we see that with the campaign of Mr. Trump in America. We see that with some of the things that have been said during the Brexit referendum campaign, you know, and even talking about Russia, the way that, you know, Mr. Farage and the then short-lived leader of the UKIP party, Madam Diane James, was a member of this parliament, saying that Putin was a man she had huge admiration for, and so on. And of course, you know, that is the reality. And we also know that Russia doesn't stop at anything, including soft loans to the National Front, which one of the members of our committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, was the broker for the loan, Mr. Schaffhauser, who got 100,000 euros commission on a $10 million euro loan to the National Front Party of France. And whenever he speaks in the committee, I talk about Radio Moscow, you know, broadcasting to the committee with the pro kind of Putin and pro so-called, you know, Donetsk People's Republic's propaganda. So, but I cannot accept as a, you know, a democratically elected, fair-minded individual that can be any moral equivalence between an act of aggression by Russia in the annexation of Crimea and in the supplying and lying about the supplying and lying about the supply of heavy weapons and clearly regular troops. These are not just, you know, local, you know, Russian-speaking Ukrainians who've risen up. They don't suddenly acquire the skills to man sophisticated artillery, rockets and tanks and book surface-to-air missiles and so on. These are properly trained Russian soldiers who've been bussed in. And as you say so rightly, clearly they couldn't find at local level even the popular enthusiasm for Ukrainian Russophones to want to back this campaign. There is no moral equivalence, or there should be any legal equivalence between an aggressor, namely the Russian Federation, and what they're doing in Donbass and Lugansk, and the victims of the aggression, which is the Ukrainians who are trying to defend their homeland and their internationally recognized borders. And I think that that message should be repeated and repeated to Madam Merkel and to Mr. Hollande, that I know we have to do business with Russia, but we cannot let their aggression to go unnoticed and uncriticized.
Mm-hmm. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the colleagues who prepared also together with us this session. I would like to conclude with one remark, also based on the experience by visiting the region along the contact line some weeks ago. It's a very good idea to have elections once that Donbass can have fair and free elections, but so all our weight, all our political weight right now must be used to achieve a ceasefire and to achieve the withdrawal of heavy weapons. This is what matters, and this is also what the citizens in this region, and I think we got this information from both sides, from citizens from both sides. This is what they want us to focus on. So I thank the panelists again and looking forward to another good panel. Thank you.
Welcome to everybody. We are starting the second panel of our conference, the sanctions. Do sanctions work? What is next? And if I can say something related to the first panel, 4 points. Russia needs to deliver its obligation. It was related to Minsk Agreement. Ukrainian soldiers are protecting Europe. Very strong statement, and we need to remember and we need to understand this kind of message. Third point, we need to bind and have binding links between Minsk Agreement and sanctions. And fourth, power of persuasion. I think that we can treat also sanctions as persuasion, as signals sent to those who organized this aggression against Ukraine. And I think that we need to have a clear view. White is white, black is black. War is war. Aggressor is aggressor. Ukraine attacked on Ukraine is attack on Ukraine. And I think that when we are discussing about sanctions, when we are discussing about diplomatic activities, we also need to remember about our moral view on those issues. And also, as Rebecca Harms mentioned in the first panel, we need to remember about people who are living under those war conditions. Rebecca, Jaromir Štetina, and me, we have participated in this illegal, from the President of the European Parliament, trip to Donetsk, to Donbass, to contact line. And I think that we understood better that this is very important to talk with people, to understand their expectations and their needs. And when we are talking about ceasefire, there are many issues related to making peace on those contact lines. And coming back to our discussion on sanctions, there are many dimensions of sanctions, restrictive measures, assets were freezed, and visa have been banned. There are some restrictions addressed for Crimea and Sevastopol, and of course there are economic sanctions, which are very important and which are addressed to major state-owned Russian banks, major Russian energy companies, major Russian defense companies, and also are related to subsidiaries outside the EU of the entities above, and those acting on their behalf or at their direction. There are some embargo solutions. We know that the problem of sanction will be discussed tomorrow during the summit, when chiefs of governments, prime ministers, presidents will participate in this discussion. We know that today this is a meeting in Normand format. We know also that the first version of the conclusions prepared for European Council is rather soft, not tough. So I think that our today's discussion should clearly show to all of us how things are going on, how the sanctions are working. Some experts are saying that this is just about 2% of minimizing Russian GDP, so it's working. But of course, sanctions are for something, are for changing the situation. If it is possible or not, how we can assess sanctions, it will be the focus on our panel. We will start with Andrei Illarionov. He is a senior fellow of the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity in Washington, and the president of the Institute of Economic Analysis, an independent economic think tank in Moscow. While in Cato, Illarionov was involved in preparation of the Cato Index of Human Freedom, and also has prepared studies on nature of the current Russian political regime, Great Recession of 2008-2009, Russian-Georgian War, history of the Russian reforms, and Russian-Ukrainian War. We have all excellent experts in this panel, And if I can ask, Andrei, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is a special honor for me to be here, to be invited by the European Parliament. I think it's a very timely hearings on the situation with in Ukraine, in the situation with the Russian-Ukrainian war, and with sanctions imposed by Western countries on the current Kremlin regime. As we all know, Western sanctions have been imposed on Kremlin in relation with mainly three events: with the occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea, with the aggression against Ukraine in eastern Donbass, and after the downing of the Malaysian flight MH17. So that is why some of the sanctions directly or indirectly are linked to those three events. We can look into effectiveness of those sanctions from the point of view whether those sanctions achieved anything in addressing those three problems. After 2.5 years since the beginning of the open phase of the Russian-Ukrainian war, Crimea is still occupied and annexed. Bloodshed in Donbass continues, as it has been shown very explicitly in the previous session. Russian authorities still deny their involvement and responsibility for the downing of the Malaysian flight MH17 with almost 300 people on board. Moreover, as we all know, the aggressive behavior of Kremlin did not stop. It actually escalated. And I will mention several facts, certainly very much, you're very much aware of that, but just to remember. February last year, one of the leaders of the Russian opposition, Boris Nemtsov, has been assassinated 200 meters near Kremlin. And you will have a chance to watch the short movie after this session about murder of Mr. Boris Nemtsov and who is responsible for that murder. Second, bloodshed continues not only in Ukraine, but also it spread to Syria, and now with bombardment of Aleppo, with new hundreds of thousands of people have been killed from the attacks of the Russian aviation. Moreover, now the escalation led to confrontation with the rest of the world and with the West, with using overall aggressive rhetorics, including the nuclear blackmail, as we all aware, over the last several weeks and months. So that is why we can see that the sanctions per se did not achieve those goals that have been envisaged initially, but the situation now became even worse compared to what we have, let's say, in summer year 2014, when most of those sanctions have been imposed. So we need to look into those sanctions and to see what particular type of sanctions achieved or did not achieve something. If we look into sectoral sanctions for Russian, different parts of the Russian economy, we could say that they might be effective, but not earlier than in medium or long-term perspective. They do not consider to be very effective in the short term. As for financial sanctions, limitations of the Russian borrowers and the Russian state and the Russian companies, the Russian banks to borrow internationally, looks like that is partially effective because now the Russian government is running a budget deficit and it is rising. This year is going to be maybe 2.5% of GDP. Next year it is planned 3.7%. And the problem is that Russian government cannot borrow internationally, and it is biting, and it is being recognized by a number of Russian ministers, by Mr. Medvedev, by Mr. Putin himself. So that is why it looks like in the medium term to long-term perspective, it is reasonably effective. But most effective sanctions happen to be not neither sectoral nor financial, but personal sanctions. Even it does not is not being reflected in the economic behavior, in political behavior of the country, but on a personal level, on psychological level, they turn out to be extremely effective, and the most of emotional outburst of the leaders in Kremlin connected exactly with the personal sanctions. Personal sanctions for some of them, and for their friends, and for their colleagues, and so on. I would like to attract your attention to some numbers that some observers or international organizations have put forward in relations of the effectiveness of sanctions. IMF has estimated that sanctions, Western sanctions imposed on Russia cost between 1 and 1.5% of GDP, which means roughly 120 to 180 billion US dollars annually. It is rather hard to verify these numbers. Okay, they have their own approach, they have own calculations. It might be, maybe less, maybe more, but it's really very hard to verify. What is important that the Russian economy over the last 2.5 years are in recession. And it is also important to bear in mind that this recession started before the sanctions have been implemented. So that is why to put some kind of price for the current recession or stagnation of the Russian economy due to sanctions is probably incorrect. And we have seen that the recession started before sanctions have been imposed. And the most important decline in economic activity in Russia was not associated with new waves of sanctions, but with the new waves of aggressive behavior of Kremlin. So that is why what looks like now, the recession and stagnation in the Russian economy is due mostly not to the sanctions mechanism and sanction regime, but due to aggressive behavior of Kremlin itself. We need to keep it in mind. So, and by the way, just for those of you who are interested with the current economic situation, over these 2.5 years recession, Russian GDP did not rise compared to 2008. It is on the same level this year as it was 8 years ago. Industrial output is 10% down. Real income of population down by 15% over the peak. It is one of the kind of very, very serious decline in living standards overall in the country. And the most remarkable is decline in investment. It is 37% down compared to the peak of investment activity 4 years ago. 4 years ago, it was before sanctions had been imposed and before even Russian-Ukrainian war. Open phase started in February 2014. So that is mostly due to internal development of the regime and aggressive behavior, both internally and externally. Now moving to the recommendations, what I would suggest to this audience and for your discussion and maybe for decisions. I have 8 points, bullet points, and I will mention them. First of all, it is necessary to close loopholes in the current sanction regimes because there are many of those loopholes and some companies and some activities and persons are avoiding the sanctions. Second, I think it is time to establish a special EU, maybe with United States, Canada, maybe some other countries, special body or special unit for monitoring a sanction regime versus Russia. Because it is necessary to collect a lot of information, who does what, under which particular situation, and on a regular basis, and to provide politicians and both in the parliaments and executive power with the timely and correct and detailed information about the sanction regime. Third, I think it would be probably goes not in line with some of the statements that have been made here. I think it is, from my point of view, it's important to disentangle sanctions regime with Minsk Agreement. Why? Because Minsk Agreement has several elements. Certainly it's one of the elements to stop bloodshed, to stop shelling, which we know did not happen. But there is a second part of the Minsk Agreement, actually a very substantial one, including the attachment and supplement of this Minsk Agreement, which actually effectively denies Ukrainian control over Eastern Donbass. And we were talking about this kind of sequence about the election and so on and so on. So I think it is incorrect to connect sanction regime with the Minsk Agreement. I think it will be much more important and much more useful for Ukraine to tie sanction regime not with Minsk Agreement, but with another documents of international law, like UN Charter, Helsinki Act, some kind of international agreements and international law agreement that Ukraine signed, including with Russia, about full restoration of the sovereignty of Ukraine over whole Ukrainian territory, including Eastern Donbass and Crimea. So that is why the goal of sanctions regime should be not only short-term or medium-term, but a longer-term and much more important, restoration of full sovereignty of Ukrainian government, of Kyiv government, over the whole territory, internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Certainly, I'm ready to discuss this in more details. Fourth, probably it is time to reconsider and maybe even to rewrite Minsk Agreement itself. Because according to Minsk Agreement, the shelling and bloodshed and withdrawal of weapons should be fulfilled by both sides, and certainly by Russian or pro-Russian side, before the end of year 2015. It has not been done. So that is why it gives Ukrainian side and all of us legal right and legal background to reconsider that part of Minsk Agreement, which is very risky and very dangerous for Ukrainian sovereignty over Eastern Donbass. Those elements that have been included into the Minsk Agreement under the pressure of Mr. Kalashnikov, as some people told me, or under the pressure of tanks and artillery and also near Debaltseve in February 2015. That element should be removed from the new version of Minsk Agreement, and they should be oriented on restoration of full sovereignty of Ukraine over the whole territory of the country. Fifth, maybe it is important to unite all sanctions already imposed on Russia on different cases like Crimea, Donbass, and maybe others, maybe Syria, that is under discussion, into one package. And the purpose would be, the goal would be very clear, the stopping aggressive behavior of the Kremlin's regime, because it's just, we cannot only react to one case or the other case or the third case, but it will be fourth, fifth, and so on. So that is why it should be united, combined package of sanctions aimed at stopping aggressive behavior at all. Six, expand personal sanctions as they look like the most effective ones. I would remind you that this March, I believe in the early March, the so-called Nadia Savchenko list became publicly available and been signed and supported by many deputies of the European Parliament, by many other politicians, and it became very, very publicly available. And that list included political leadership of Russia. As soon as these lists became publicly available, 10 days later, Mr. Putin started negotiations about release of Nadia Savchenko. This is the most effective mechanism that we have seen. So I think it's time to to take it much more seriously and to work with personal sanctions against not only some kind of second or third tier people in the Kremlin, but also with the political leadership of this regime. Second, who should be included into this personal list? So-called personal money keepers, or whatever, piggy money. They just kind of, Panama Papers revealed some names who are keeping millions and billions of dollars for the leaders of the Russia's regime. Later, kind of a few weeks ago, new names appeared. Those people, regardless of their so-called respectable status as a violinist or some kind of culture leaders around the world, are keeping money for the repressive, aggressive regime. So that is why they are personally involved in supporting and sustaining this regime. So those people should be included in this list as well. Also, these lists should be expanding for so-called generals and officers of disinformation troops of Kremlin, because they are playing incredibly dangerous role for distorting picture within Russia and outside of Russia. Seventh point, I think it's time came to develop and implement sanctions against the Russian state companies in energy sector, especially for those who export energy outside of the country, including Gazprom and Rosneft. 8, sanctions that we're talking about, regardless how wide and strong and deep they are, they should be considered only as one element, one important part, but just one part of much more comprehensive strategy aimed at actually finishing aggressive behavior of this regime, and if it is impossible to stop the aggressive behavior of the regime, in the regime itself. I would, in my concluding statements, I would say that 8 years ago, the failure to impose effective deterrent for aggressive behavior of Kremlin as a result of the Russian-Georgian war, as a result of the Russian attack on Georgia, led to occupation and annexation of Crimea. Failure to implement effective deterrent after occupation and annexation of Crimea led to war in Donbass. Failure to implement effective deterrent after the war in Ukraine led to Syria and to bombardment of Aleppo. Failure to develop, design, and implement sanctions and other deterrent mechanisms after bombardment of Aleppo will definitely lead, and nobody should have any doubts about that, to new attacks, to new aggressions, to more and more people being killed and more people becoming refugees. 8 years ago, as a result of Russian-Georgian war, about 1,000 people have been killed on both sides. As a result of Russian-Ukrainian war, as has already been mentioned, about 10,000 people have been killed. As a result of the Syrian war, and now direct involvement of Kremlin in Syrian war, at least 400,000 people have been killed in Syria, and millions of people became refugees, many of them coming here in European countries. If that trend continues, it means more and more people will be killed, more millions will become refugees with possible destabilization for some countries, not only in the Middle East or in the former Soviet Union, but here in Europe as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ilarionov. I think that it is important to consider your assessment of functioning of sanctions in mid-term and in long term, and some doubts related to the short term. And also, thank you very much for your recommendations, because very often in the European Union, also in our Parliament, we are discussing how to push European Union institutions, our governments, to keep sanctions, to continue sanctions. But you have expressed very strongly that if we want to consider how to achieve our goals, our objectives, to stop Russia's aggressiveness, we need to change the model. We need to change our measures. Yes, they should be united. They should be in one package, and very wisely and very reasonable analyzed in the relation to efficiency, in the relation to effectiveness. So thank you very much. I think we will discuss about it. But now we want to ask Hans van Balan from European Parliament, member of European Parliament, from ALDE Group, also the member of Foreign Affairs Committee and Subcommittee for Security and Defense, to share with us his view on MH17 findings of the investigation. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Chair. Let us first go into the following fact. Putin Russia has, like all dictatorship, a very uneasy relationship with facts and the truth. So dictatorships like Putin Russia have disinformation, defamation, and they never accept facts as they are. we in real democracies should only act when we have the facts together and act on the basis of facts. First fact is that Putin Russia has never accepted the independence of its neighbors. All the neighbors which were part of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact are called the near abroad, and they must recognize dominance by Russia in politics, economics, and in military fields. This is a fact. And if you look to Georgia, Moldova, Russia, but also the behavior of Russia towards the Baltic states, there is the proof. Given this, the fact is that neighbors have to be crippled. Look at Ukraine. After what I call a democratic revolution against an authoritarian regime, Russia wanted to punish, and Russia wanted to get Russia close to itself, Ukraine close to itself. Russia invaded Crimea. Those people dressed in green uniforms without distinctions, Russia always said they're not Russians. Lately, Putin said that they were Russian troops. So Russian troops invaded Ukraine, and after that, by an illegal referendum, it was illegally annexed by Russia. If you look to eastern Ukraine, you can say that there was not a kind of genocide against Russian people, not at all. They had the right to speak their language. There was not a problem. And what you see is Russia said, we have not started the rebellion, the people there. But how do people then get heavy artillery, which is not Ukrainian? How do they get it? How can they fight the Ukrainian army if they have not been trained and supported logistically, etc.? Today we know also that the rebels are part of the Russian command structure. They not operate on their own. There's all facts. We also know that the Minsk II agreement was not executed, and the basic element in this agreement is that Ukraine should be able to patrol their own borders. Again, the borders recognized by the international community in eastern Ukraine. And it has not been done. Now we come to the MH17. Russia had many stories what happened. No artillery. Yes, there was artillery, but it was Ukrainian. No, we have no radar images. Yes, we have them, but we can't give them to the investigation team. Many stories, disinformation. And what you see is that the public, which has no clear background on this, says, I don't understand anymore. That people in the Netherlands say, maybe in many other countries, we hear so many stories, but it is who brings the stories. So also here, only the fact can help us. And without a shadow of a doubt, the joint investigation team came to revealing conclusions. First of all, this team was composed out of the Netherlands, for the clear fact that it started at Schiphol Amsterdam International Airport, and 2/3 of the casualties were Dutch. Malaysia, because it was a Malaysian airliner. Ukraine, because it was on the territory of Ukraine, so this is not manipulation, this is international law, and Australia and Belgium. It is led by a Dutch prosecutor general, Mr. Fred Westerbeke. In the Netherlands, a minister of justice or another minister cannot give commands or instructions to the prosecutor. If that would happen, the prosecutor steps down and goes public, and the minister has to resign. So this is a fact. There cannot be manipulation. If we look then on what has been established, again, without a shadow of doubt, is that it was a Russian book. Not an Ukrainian, a Russian one. Coming from Russia, being transported to rebel-held territory, there it shot down the MH17, and then it was transported back to Russia. These are facts. It took a long time to establish them. We had first the Dutch Safety Board, tried to get all the facts together than the prosecutor general in this international team did, so it took a lot of time, because in fact they confirmed the accusations and the proof of Bellingcat. But they couldn't just say that, they proved it all again. Thousands of hours of telephone and radio conversation with people who really know, experts who know who is speaking, which is the accent, etc. So not just by people looking at this evidence. If you look further, all photographs taken by soldiers on the ground, soldiers do this, send it away. You can see which hour it is, where the sun stands, etc. So they did this for many, many months. They came with this conclusion where they say, it is a Russian book from Russia, transported to rebel-held area, it's shot down, MH17 was brought back. So this conclusion means that there is Russian direct involvement. I don't say that it is Kremlin-led involvement, or on the highest military level, or on, let us say, the tactical military level, but it is a Russian position. Russia is responsible. Even if Putin wouldn't have known, he is responsible. This is a fact. The Dutch Prime Minister asked Russia to fully cooperate. Fully. The radar images are not transferred to this joint investigative team. Has not been done. This is the first thing Russia must do, and fully cooperate. Of course, we know that it is highly unlikely, let me say this in diplomatic, that Russia does, but still, we have to ask them. We must be sure that we can get an answer, because the facts count. In the end, if you look at Lockerbie in Great Britain and Scotland, in 1988, it took many, many years, but in the end it was established that it was done by Gaddafi. Mm-hmm. And Gaddafi more or less recognized by giving compensation and handing out the person who was responsible. So this will take maybe many extra years. Interesting is that Australia, the foreign minister, Mrs. Bishop, already said that the 100 people who are identified, there are 100 people who have a role played in this case, that she thinks that those people will be not only be identified, but we will close the gap and see that maybe 10 who are actually involved, who did push the button, and so they must be prosecuted. And again, what I said, Russia must work with it. At this moment, the Dutch government didn't plead for extra sanctions because they want to give Russia the opportunity to work with the team, although it's highly unlikely. But it should not be said that Mr. Putin will say, okay, I was not even allowed in, I was not asked, I had no position, so therefore. But if we look at sanctions in general, for me, as a member of ALDE, but many others from other political parties have the same view, the sanctions should stay. They should not be mitigated. Indeed, if we look at Syria, the Brits and the Americans said we should also have sanctions on this case. It has nothing to do with the Russian actions in Ukraine, but of course, if you see that hospitals are bombed, that it is impossible for people to escape Aleppo, Russians are directly responsible because they could alter the situation directly. So I agree that also here we can't stand idly by. So we keep the sanctions, probably update them on the sanctions on Ukraine. If Putin will not work with us in this joint investigation team, I think it's inevitable that we have sanctions on that. And then I am sympathetic to the idea that we maybe should put them together. But there's also a problem. The European Union has done what some thought was not possible, to have these sanctions. If we make it very complicated by adding others and then putting them together, maybe that's too much for decision-making in the European Union. And for me, it's key that we keep the sanctions we have and can even upgrade them, but we shouldn't lose. Because let us be honest, Viktor Orban received Putin. Viktor Orban, who was once a heir of the 56 Hungarian revolution, received Putin as a friend. If you see other countries, Putin puts informal sanctions on them or offers grants to them, so they are heavily involved. So keep the sanctions we have and try to upgrade. That is my position. Thank you very much. And also on the web, if you want to read the whole investigation, it's www.om, from Openbaar Ministerie, Public Prosecutor Office in the Netherlands, .nl, om.nl. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think this is a good case, good example how the cooperation with Russia look like, with many problems. And of course, this message made by you to keep sanctions and to update such sanctions, I think it's very important. And in the course in which we have started our panel. And now I want to ask Andrew Redman, Brussels-based journalist, specializing in foreign affairs, including Russia, the Western Balkans, and the Middle East. He works full-time for the news website EU Observer and a freelancer for the Times of London. In 2015, Andrew Redman won the Sergei Magnitsky Human Rights Award. The floor is yours, please.
Hi. Thanks, first of all, for the opportunity to speak here today. I feel a little shy because of some of the distinguished other speakers, so I hope they correct me where I go wrong, either from the panel or from the floor. I entitled my little paper, EU Sanctions on Russia Should Aim for Regime Change. And it's quite clearly provocative, because that phrase is most usually associated with America's attack on Saddam Hussein and the suffering and destabilizing effect that had on the region. But I wanted to be provocative because tomorrow at the EU summit, where leaders will hold a debate on Russia, I've got a feeling we're going to hear a lot of quietist language, apologetic language toward the Russian regime. We'll probably hear the EU is appalled about the massacre in Aleppo. Some might even use the words war crimes. We'll probably hear disappointment about Russia's ongoing war on Ukraine, or in technical language, its non-fulfillment of Minsk provisions. And we might also hear concern about its other abuses of the international norms of behavior. And the list here is a long one. It could start with the propaganda campaign designed to destabilize Europe and legitimize a regime that's robbing its own people and killing or jailing the few, such as Mr. Nemtsov or Magnitsky, who dared to stand up to it. It could mention Russia's meddling in EU and US electoral processes, whether by its loans to the National Front or the hacking of the Democratic Party. It could mention Russia's mockery of, frankly, every single international club it has the privilege to be a member of, whether the UNSC, where it blocks resolutions against its genocidal friend Bashar al-Assad, the NATO-Russia Council, where it cries foul over NATO soldiers in Baltic states while moving nuclear missiles to within range of Berlin, Interpol, where it uses red notices to harass dissidents, the WTO, the Energy Charter Treaty, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, even sports bodies such as World Athletics and soccer federations, where Russian doping and bribery are finally coming to light. Now, the phrase war crimes does not sound apologetic, but moral outrage without action is cheap. And the fact is that even the most hawkish EU countries, be that Poland, Sweden, or the UK, tend to apologize for EU sanctions as being some kind of minimum that they could do. These sanctions we hear have to be targeted, smart, proportionate, reversible. US diplomats, when they speak of the effect of sanctions, defend them on grounds that they're unlikely to cause a systemic crisis in the Russian economy or even the bankruptcy of any Russian firms. Moderate EU states, France and Germany, say there is a need for dialogue or selective engagement, and that additional sanctions could be an obstacle here. And Russia's friends in the EU Council, be that Italy or Hungary or Greece, say sanctions are counterproductive to what they see as Europe's partnership with Russia. Now, I wanted to switch for one moment from the world of international relations to that of espionage. When British spies try to turn a foreign agent, they consider the acronym MICE or MICE. It stands for money, ideology, compromise, and ego. The idea is that people betray their country either because you pay them, because they believe in your system of ideas, because you've got something compromising on them, or just out of ego that they want to feel special, important. It's worth asking which of these apply to Russia's friends, whether those in the EU Council dinner tomorrow or here among you in the European Parliament. Russia's used the lure of gas and other contracts to bribe some of our leaders, and I wonder if some of those MEPs who routinely vote to defend Putin have fully declared their business interests. It certainly uses compromise and intimidation, including nuclear intimidation. What saddens me the most is that some people defend Russia's interests out of sheer gullibility, swallowing its anti-European, anti-American propaganda, or out of pride, they need to feel different and special. If you strip all that away, you're left with a stark fact. Putin's Russia has become a criminal state, both unto its own people and unto its neighbors and the wider world. The way that law-abiding communities protect themselves from criminals is to remove them. They do not talk about targeted or smart penalties or about dialogue and selective engagement. The other stark fact is that the EU and US have a lot more power, and I don't mean military power, to protect themselves from this toxic regime than they have so far exercised. The economic sanctions still allow for many types of credit and many types of technology transfer to Russian oil firms, arms makers, and banks. They allow Russia's gas firms to do business as usual, even to build new pipelines to Europe. They allow clearinghouses such as SWIFT in Belgium to handle Russian transactions. The visa bans and asset freezes allow Putin and most of his cronies to travel freely in Europe, to hide money in Europe's banks and offshore firms, and to buy luxury homes and places in prestigious schools for their families and friends. Well, I entitled my paper, Sanctions Should Aim for Regime Change, so I should end up by saying what I think that might look like. When flight MH17 was shot down 2 years ago, EU options papers on Russia proposed much more far-reaching measures than we ever saw implemented. One such option was halting gas purchases. If implemented, that would surely hurt Europe, but it would also, and I dare say almost overnight, bring the Russian economy to its knees and destroy the regime's ability to keep power by paying rent to governors like Mr. Kadyrov and by guaranteeing a basic standard of living for its people. In the current climate of disinformation and repression inside Russia, I doubt that change could come from the bottom up, however. Going back to Iraq, that kind of change could also cause a kind of centrifugal chaos that brings even more destructive forces into play. But going back also to the acronym MICE, I believe that the Russian elite, which keeps Putin in office, understands only one language, money. I believe that if we took away his ability to keep feeding money to the Kremlin clans, they would, sooner or later, remove him and his policies in a bottom-down process, and then start, perhaps, a real dialogue with the civilized world. Now, if humble journalists, such as those working on the Panama Papers dossier, can find out where people keep their ill-gotten gains, I'm pretty sure Western intelligence services know more. We don't need to provoke an economic crisis in Russia. We need to freeze all that dirty money in our banks, to seize the Manhattan, Mayfair, and Marbella homes bought with funds stolen from the Russian taxpayer, and take away the means to pay the school fees and marina fees. The rest should follow. I said EU sanctions should aim at regime change, but in fact we hardly need sanctions. We just need to aggressively implement the existing laws that govern our financial sectors in order to move toward a world free from Putin's menace. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's clear, I think, that we are not only talking about sanctions, keeping sanctions, upgrading sanctions. We are talking how to tackle, how to manage the problem of Russia in our times, in our time. And I think it's very important because sanctions are the part of possible tools. Our activity in many areas, also understanding this disinformation and propaganda activities, made by Russia is very important, because I see that many of our colleagues also in European Parliament are, some of them are, because of their ideological choice and money, under the Russia pressures, but some of them I think that are living under those misinformation activities done by Russia. So we need comprehensive solutions, as it was mentioned at the beginning during the panel. And now I want to go to Ludmiła Kozłowska, the president of the Open Dialog Foundation, co-operator of our event today, a human rights defender, initiator and founder of the Open Dialog Foundation, and its president of the board since June 2010. She is also one of the coordinators of the international campaign for the release of the Ukrainian political prisoners from the Let My People Go list kept in Russia or on the territory of the illegally occupied Crimea. Ludmiła, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be with you here. I want to underline that European Parliament is really the only open platform where we can speak about human rights and do something effectively, release people. I'm speaking about this issue because I know that from every side, Russian propaganda uses every moment to attack EU institutions, and I think it's crucial for human rights defenders, for everyone who is here to know that it is really important and we value your work. My speech is about new sanctions and how to influence Russia's policy and save Kremlin's hostages. First of all, I want to say that President Putin doesn't honor his commitment, and the Minsk Agreement doesn't really work also in the aspect of hostages release. We cannot rely on Putin's obligations, we cannot trust Lavrov and others, but we can and we should care about their reactions on every statement, on every letter, and every sanctions towards to them. We should really carefully observe how they react and what will be really effective. Effectiveness of the sanctions is just a matter of the time, but one of the factors is crucial. Pro-Western Ukraine and civil society in Russia have to survive longer than Putin. Freezing all the assets abroad, introducing the universal trade embargo and travel ban for its politicians, civil servants, and business allied with the Kremlin would result in Russian economic decline and growing internal tensions. And again, current sanctions are good, but they have to be strengthened and extended. There are a lot of gaps in them, sometimes execution of lacking efficiency, and there are situations in which the sanctions Russian officials are making fun of them taking pictures in the heart of Paris or other EU cities. We heard that Angela Merkel, besides the UK and US, intended to enhance the sanctions against Russia. That is obviously good, but at the same time, it is hard to accept the ongoing Nord Stream 2 project and many other examples of German business cooperating with Russia. As Open Dialog Foundation, we call the EU to draw your attention for three categories of sanctions. First, to work and to implement the personal list of sanctions to Russian elites, which could become a preventive measure for political persecution and kidnapping of the Ukrainian by Russian forces. Besides the people who are being killed in Ukraine every day, there is a category of hostages of Kremlin, Ukrainians illegally kept and tortured in Russia and occupied Crimea. We call them Let My People Go list. Since Open Dialog Foundation is working on advocating concrete cases on the hostages of Kremlin, and first of all on Savchenko case in the past, we can for sure confirm that an international attention, especially European Parliament, European Commission, and personal sanctions are the means which could help to release the Kremlin hostages. Release of Savchenko was not goodwill of Putin. It is Putin fears about highly negative publicly and sanctions against him and Russian officials involved in her case. This is why Savchenko list, on the beginning, just our civil society appeal, initiative which till now not even come into force, were so important and so effective. I remind just that a lot of members of European Parliament, more than 50, supported our initiative and wrote this letter to Mogherini. We have nowadays more than 50% kept in Kremlin since 2014 only for Russian propaganda purpose. We call them politically motivated because their cases lay on Russian propaganda to explain their aggressive attacks towards Ukraine. And only a few of them were released or under conditional release. All these arrests and kidnappings are a result of total impunity of Russian elites, and first of all, Putin. The last arrest happened just a few days ago, 12th of October. At least 5 Crimean Tatars were arrested and accused being extremists. And at least 1 Ukrainian was arrested during crossing the checkpoint in Jankoy just because of possessing Ukrainian book, and Russian authorities recognized it as extremist book. How many we don't know about such kind of cases? We don't have access to Crimea to do regular monitoring of detention places and to check what is the reason of being detained of all of these people. We must not forget them. So I would like to use this opportunity to call again to work on the list of Savchenko. It will be a more symbolical name, but the main category of people also on the top with Putin are responsible for all of the persecution, the Let My People Go list of persons. This will help us to stop the feeling of impunity. It also will help us to make uncomfortable and more reachable for Russian elites to come back and use on the daily basis benefits from European products, technology, financial services, transportation hubs, stores, university, and hospitals. All of these Russian normal citizens doesn't have possibility to use because they don't have money, because they don't have possibility to come to EU countries because of huge corruption or sanctions, even internal sanctions. So these elites have a lot to lose, but we have to take these issues seriously and increase the pressure as much as possible. If Putin has to face internal problems, he will struggle for his own survival, and the neighbors' country will have more peace and freedom to shape their own policies. Second, we should support Russian democratic forces, politicians, civil and media, in Russia and abroad as much as only it's possible. And it should be done now, not in 2 years when it will be too late. Civil Russian society underlined that disconnecting Russia from SWIFT system would break money laundering operation of the corrupt Putin's elite and will be perhaps a grave blow of their well-being. The EU should adopt a policy of using every pretext to impose even mere sanctions and enforce all related decisions, like decision of the 50 billion award for the former shell quarters of UCAS, like introducing a Magnitsky Act, similarly as the US, like closing and or freezing assets of Russia today. But please be open-minded for manipulation of EU values from Russian side. Freezing assets of Russia today, it's not stopping freedom of the speech. It's actually stopping Russian military propaganda, and we have to care about such kind of things. Additionally, EU has to encourage and mobilize Ukrainian authorities to maintain hard sanctions policy towards Russia as well. When it comes to Russian society, it is a struggle between a fridge and a TV set. So it is also necessary to remember about the information war and take care about Russia providing them with a quality and accessible media content, thus supplement the sanctions policy. The information pillar is necessary, but now actually Putin who holds all the cards. The third, stopping payments for Russia's oil and gas, which is technically much easier and faster than stopping transit. Or at least, as Polish member of the parliament Marcin Ćmielewski suggested, reducing the amount of oil and gas purchased by EU countries from Russia would decrease EU dependence from them and undermine the economy of Russia. Russia has a bright future, but it is a future without Putin and his cronies. It is a European future. Russia, Ukraine, and the EU could and should benefit from its future and stable cooperation. But to make it possible, authoritarian, anti-European Russia must over. The road is clear, and sanctions are the only maintained direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ludmila. You know that in the European Parliament you have many advocates and many supporters of of your activity and your foundation activity. And I think that it is very important to have this comprehensive view on all those aspects related to Russia aggressiveness in this time, and also to think, to consider about our responses and comprehensive responses. Now we have 10 minutes for discussion and exchange of views. Anna Gomes, member of European Parliament, one of our organizers of this meeting and event.
Thank you so much for the panelists, and I, building on what they said, I would very much like to second what Mr. Redmond said, that indeed it's not more than implementing our own laws regulating finance and fighting money laundering to indeed freeze the dirty money and to actually make liable those who are responsible. But that is involved, and that's probably an angle we have forgotten. Those who are the enablers in the EU, the enablers of all this money laundering activity from money deviated from Russian state coffers and in all sorts of corrupt deals and embezzlement. The enablers in the EU involve banks, lawyers, and nobody has been, to this moment, taken to court. I think this is a crucial question. I mean, we have just heard with the Deutsche Bank heavily involved in the money laundering for Russian oligarchy. Nobody has been taken to court being responsible for that. This is a very important angle, and I hope indeed that this is a matter where also our own investigation on the Panama Papers will be able to push. I would also, in this respect, I would like to say that one area where we could, building on what Ms. Kozlova just said, that we need to support civil society in Russia, and now, one way to actually support it, but at the same time help her feed us the work we have to do here, is actually to get more detailed, specific information. For instance, if there is information on MEPs who are have actually money or other links, we should actually be able to uncover that, and to, if there is a disconnect with the declarations of interest, we should be able to act on that. But more than that, I mean, for instance, all these golden visa policies of several European countries are obviously a conduit for enabling corrupt people from Russia and elsewhere actually stack the money in the EU. Civil society in Russia could actually be enabled by us to actually help us guide in the investigations that we need. European governments hide behind data protection. For instance, I've been asking my own government, Portugal, to give me the list of all the people that were given golden visas in the recent years, since this program exists in 2012. And they hide under data protection. But if I am the one supplying the names of the people suspected or the relatives and so on, there's no excuse on data protection, and I could have much more things. So there's an articulation with civil society in Russia who is doing great work, as we see, for instance, in this paper we have here from the Anti-Corruption Foundation, but to actually be more targeted so that we will be more effective. Now, my question would be to Mr. Ilarionov, and if you could provide us with more information, maybe other members as well, on this campaign directed by the Putin regime to actually not just fund corrupt people and influence their behavior, even here in the parliament, but to fund xenophobic populist parties like the Front National, as it was already mentioned, but actually a propaganda driven to actually break the EU. It's very important to actually point out that this propaganda is actually driven towards breaking the EU. And I don't think an effort has been really made to actually show that this is the objective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we can collect some brief questions, I think it will be easier to continue our debate. If somebody wants to ask us, please, could you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. I'm Vladislav Shurov. I'm from Ukraine. And before asking the question, I would like to say that I love my country. And the first question is concerning the sanctions, that the degree, that the percentage of, that the 15% lower level of the humans in the Russia. And for me, I think that it's lead to usual people starvation if it will be continue. And it's inhuman treatment to them, isn't it? And the second question, it's my personal opinion, that I think that Russia can continue the actions they do now for several years. And it is not a secret that Ukraine recognizes it as a non-international armed conflict, anti-terroristic operation. And maybe it would be better to recognize it as an international armed conflict and to have a right of self-defense, which is stated in the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If somebody wants to comment or ask, we have one. Yes, please.
Good day, my name is Marina Yaroshevich and I represent Ukrainian World Congress here. First of all, I would like to thank European Parliament for opening the door and to all the co-organizers and supporters of this event among members of the European Parliament, because what we hear here is definitely like eye-opening experience. On the other hand, I do think that here in the audience, we do have people who are friends of Ukraine and who are very kind of inclined to take the positions that the speakers were articulating here. So my question is it realistic to initiate European Parliament resolution on sanctions towards Russia? I mean, tomorrow we're going to follow the discussion and the day after tomorrow of the European Council, and we know that sanctions are still in place until 31st of January. It's not clear exactly what's going to happen afterwards. So the European Parliament as a locomotive of all those steps in the right direction could probably take a lead this time as well. And this event is definitely a step in the right direction. So can we anticipate any resolution? Thank you.
One question more. The last, please.
Agency for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation. And my question is, Ludmila Kozlova mentioned about to stop connection for Russian banks out of the system of SWIFT. Several years ago, ex-Prime Minister of Great Britain, this issue also arose on the Council of EU. And it's still discussion, this discussion is not out of the agenda. Who can who can provide again such proposals to switch Russian financial system from SWIFT?
Thank you very much. I think that we want to give the floor to our panelists for brief comments, final comments in our panel, in our discussion, and after that we will ask Petras Auštrevičius for conclusions. Mr. Ilarionov, please.
Yes. As for Mr. Putin's policy towards European Union and just very clearly aimed on some kind of weakening or even breaking the European Union, is absolutely clear. It's a lot of evidence. Some of facts you have mentioned, but certainly you know more, and we all know much more information. It's only support for extreme politicians in European countries. It's an intimidation campaign, it is disinformation campaign, it's a corruption, it's a support for Brexit, it's support for Le Pen, and so on. What is important to keep in mind, that is not, first of all, short-term policy, it is not ad hoc policy, it is very long planned, it's comprehensive, coherent, long-term policy, really having in the final goal is really weakening or destroying European Union, European institutions. Because what they fear of combined united front. For them it is much easier to deal with every country, with every political force one by one. So that is why wherever it is possible, it is necessary to keep unity. Unity of existing institutions and creating new institutions or new fronts united, including with these sanctions. Because for them it's easy to deal one by one. It is much harder to deal with deal with the united front. So that is why you need to keep in mind this approach. Second, as I understand correctly, Vladislav's question about 15% decline in living standards, right? So yes, it's very painful for the Russian population, and it is going to continue because there is no growth, and there will be no growth. It will be, in the best way, stagnation, in the more or less predicted way, recession, in which living standards of population will go down. The main question would arise on this: how long it could continue, and whether this decline in living standards would affect political behavior of the regime. My answer is very clear and very simple: no. There is no such a connection between economic situation and political policy or geopolitical policy in authoritarian regimes, in hard authoritarian regime, in dictatorship. It does exist in democracies. It does exist in free societies because it's a very clear mechanism of translating economic problems, economic hardships into political life, in discussion and a changing decision, whether in election or in the whole political process. Authoritarian system built on a very different fundament, so it's impossible to translate. In Russian, there is a saying, you're probably familiar with that, the conversation between the kid and his father. Vodka became much more expensive. Papa, does it mean that you will drink less? No, child, it means you will eat less. So it's just a reflection of authoritarian regime. So just the very fact that economic hardships for Russian population does not mean that they will become less aggressive. For them, it's not a problem, and those people, majority of people, do not have, actually not even majority, everybody, including oligarchs. I mean, the former old oligarchs and new oligarchs, they don't have any opportunity to influence the political decisions of Kremlin or one person. Just you need to understand. Because in a hard authoritarian regime, there are economic factor does not play almost any substantial role. There are two most important mechanisms, two most important machines do play important role for sustainability of dictatorship. The first one is mechanism of terror, for roughly 10-15% of population who are courageous to stand up. And you know the result, like Anna Politkovskaya, Alexander Litvinenko, Boris Nemtsov, and many others. And for the rest of population is a mechanism of propaganda, of disinformation troops. So who are trying to brainwash them and actually many people outside of the country. So that is why when if we're really serious about thinking how to change this regime, or at least how to protect partially Russian population and population of other countries, it is necessary to address the work of these two machines, machines of terror and machines of propaganda, of disinformation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Redman.
Just a couple of quick comments. I agree with Ms. Gomes that enablers should be dragged out there. And indeed, when you look at Deutsche Bank, I mean, I think it's going to be fine for mis-selling mortgages, not for laundering Russian money and sanctions busting. But rather than fining these banks and perhaps destabilizing the banking system, why not just put one of the big CEOs on trial and see how the others behave afterwards? And finally, picking up on something that Ms. Kozlowska mentioned about Russia today and in the UK, it's instructing how a regulatory crackdown can have a political effect. We're seeing this here. As I understand it, NatWest closed the accounts, or is closing the accounts, of a service provider to Russia today, under suspicion that they were that service provider was channeling illegal money to maybe political personalities or other figures of influence in the UK. That effectively one of Russia Today's subsidiaries had become a conduit for black funds to go to figures in British society. NatWest is not doing this, as I understand, under the instructions of the British government or the American. They want to do this because they want to avoid potential fines. But if they cut off those means for Russia Today to operate, then there'll clearly be a political effect. That's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Van Balen.
Yes. Also some very short comments. First of all, has Ukraine the right of self-defense? Of course. But then also the army should be fit to defend the country. And in the beginning, you couldn't trust many of the generals because they were together with the Russian generals at the same academies when they started their career. And they were not rightly trained, and they simply were not up to the job. There's another thing, that behind closed doors, also Western powers said to Ukraine, just don't do anything, just try to avoid a direct clash. I think that Putin takes into account if there is the option of, let me say, a counteraction by Ukraine or the West. I mean, that is for him important. If he knows that nothing will happen, he will feel and try to go on. So we have to train and help the Ukrainian army. Secondly, resolutions. Resolutions are important, but they're also paperwork. What we should do as MPs and MEPs is to also put influence to our governments to stand tall. Of course, a government has a different responsibility than a parliament. We are freer to say things, but the government should stand tall because it is about breaking international law. It's breaking the tradition of the Helsinki process, that borders cannot be changed but by consent. So it's for all a threat what Putin has been doing and is doing. SWIFT, yes, for me, I mean, if nothing works, we have to turn to bigger sanctions which will hit more. So yes, I think that you have to escalate, but then we have to be very keen and united. The moment if France would say, I just call a country, we don't escalate, then there is not that unanimity. So we should aim at unanimity. It's all long term. Let me say the same with Lockerbie. And then the last thing, in South Africa, it were not the international sanctions which brought down apartheid. However, they helped. The fact that the South Africans could not play in all kinds of games. You could say, is that important? For them, that was quite important. That they were not welcome. So the sanctions helped. And we should have the two-track approach, which was also applied to South Africa. Speak with Russian society. Discuss with them. And, of course, provide objective information. Not counter propaganda with propaganda, but with real information. And, of course, the people who say the Russians don't know about internet or they don't use it, they only use it to buy things. I don't know, but the information should be there, independent, for those who want to use it. And we have to work with the Russian opposition and Russian NGOs and society. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ludmila?
Thank you. I just want to add maybe some more information about support for civil society in Russia with regard to what Ms. Gomes said. We have to remember that nowadays support should be really very smart. Every support, every financial support, first of all, for civil society in Russia could be recognized by Russian authority as afterwards a foreign agent or putting such kind of person into the custody. But what it should be also remembered at the same time, if there is no support, if there is no instrument, real instrument which supports such kind of activists, especially in region, we have no peaceful future with Russia. In order to have peaceful future with Russia, EU has to build real bridges with civil society of Russia. The same should be bridges between Ukrainian civil society and Russian civil society bridges. So it's investment, but it will be result in the future in our peace. So we have to carry it now, not in 2 years, not in 3 years, with a long, but at the same time, remember this long perspective strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all panelists. I think that it was very, very inspiring panel, and that it is important to understand that we are challenging completely new phenomenon, this Putin's Russia, so that our answers, our responses should be also new, comprehensive, and not ad hoc. I fully agree. This is very important. And if I can say, wrapping up this panel, we need to know more, we need to understand deeper, and we need to react better and stronger and much more adequately to all those challenges. And now I want to ask Petras Auštrevičius to make wrap up, to make summary, and present conclusions of our conference after two very exciting and very important and fruitful intellectual panels.
Thank you, Michał. Thank you very much to all of you who came today to our discussion and conference on this issue. And once again, I wish to emphasize that our event, to my mind, is very, very timely indeed, since we preside and discuss here in Brussels and Normandy in Berlin. But in general, the issue is not over. I mean, let's not fool ourselves that situation is getting better. I agree with those who say that things are getting worse and develop certainly not the way we all anticipate. And we must be ready for this. Kremlin has organized so-called elections in Crimea and has reacted to the MH17 findings and investigation with yet another proportion of hostility and propaganda. So, no tangible changes in Russian behavior, some say. The sanctions do not work, they presume, and they are partly right. But I strongly reject this line of thinking that sanctions are worthless, and this is an absolutely wrong view, to my understanding. Exactly, the sanctions we have at the moment help to stop Russia from creating a much bigger catastrophe. Kharkiv, Odessa, and Kiev were the real targets of this plan, which failed. And this is a fact. Putin was not just looking at Crimea and Donbass. He had much bigger strategy. What also happened was that imposing of these sanctions served as a solidarity test for the EU, which we did pass. In many regards, this was a very healthy and unifying exercise, in my view. Some say a wake-up call for the EU, and I do agree, so just do not fall asleep again. Things are not over, and the unity of the European Union remains a fundamental instrument and great important value to maintain. Certainly, we all expect much more for Kremlin's retreat from eastern Ukraine and Crimea. First and foremost, but don't forget the occupied Georgian territories too, the Russian role in Moldova, and this massive propaganda warfare against the minds of the EU citizens. The list is rather long, and we have a legitimate expectation of all this to end one good day. Here, two things are important. Firstly, we will need much more time to be able to see the results. let's be frank and clear. Our final goal is a free, democratic, and European Russia. It is realistic. Is it realistic with Putin in power? Not, of course. We therefore simply have to choose other than being prepared for many more years of confrontation with Putin's Russia. Nobody likes that, of course. This is a grim reality. But those who are anticipating Russia's helping hand in Middle East may now go and face the relatives of Aleppo victims. It's a grim fact, but sorry, I have to announce this. Secondly, we need to put much more into the concept of sanctions, and I do appreciate elaborations of we heard during this panel discussion. They're very useful and very insightful. The word sanctions is scary to some, but in my opinion, the scope of current sanctions is far too narrow and needs to be well expanded. When one speaks with the Democrats and dissidents of Russia, one of the first things they will ask you is, why have you put only few of the oligarchs, Putin's cronies, into the sanctions list? Why only some 10 names when there are around 150 of them? In addition to these oligarchs, there are hundreds and hundreds of the Russian officials and military figures who have properties in Europe and Americas, who enjoy vacations in the West. Those children are put into the most expensive Western universities, schools, and so on. None of their funds are legal. All this is stolen from Russian people and, of course, a result of great corruption. All this rather easy to prove, as the income of all the Russian officials is public. Sooner or later, time will come when the ordinary Russian people will ask us in the West and EU the legitimate and very clear question. Why have you been covering these thieves? Where is our money? And I hope this time will come. To sum up, nothing will be achieved if the EU itself is not ready to bear some losses, even for some time, or even much more significant losses than exist at the moment. If we say that we in the European Union, and I quote here the fifth guiding principle of the EU-Russian relations as agreed in March earlier this year, are willing, I quote, are willing to support more and more the Russian civil society and engage and invest in people-to-people contacts and exchanges and policies that are related to that. This only means that we, in the EU, have to be ready to suffer together with Russian civil society and citizens. In other words, the Western politicians have to finally cut this thread of corruption, which on one end starts in Russia, but on the other hand finishes here in the EU capitals, in our banks and property markets. Only if we cut this thread, we will be able to say that everything has been done from our side. I'm sure that it's doable, and this is exactly what must be done by such a values-based community as the European Union stands. Ladies and gentlemen, I do thank all panelists who joined our event. I hope all the contributions and discussions have enriched our understanding on today's situation, which is complicated indeed, but by this we show our commitment. And I do take the words of and the question of our colleague Victor Buștinaru about the possibility to have hearings and debate at Foreign Affairs and probably SEDE committees. We have to do our the best. We have to expand community of like-minded and information-wise as well. We have to share that, and I'm looking forward for this possibility, even keeping an eye on a resolution which we might produce. At this moment, let me to thank all organizers, my colleagues Michał Boni, Anna Gomes, Rebecca Harms, who had to leave, Charles Tannock as well, and Open Dialog Foundation for this event. You see logos of those usual suspects who raise this issue, but they do represent those normal and classical parties and groups in the European Parliament which have representatives deeply involved in this issue. And with this in mind, and thanking you for coming, I wish to announce that after this event, immediately we will switch to another one, not less interesting, since we have a very fresh documentary which is produced with the great cooperation of our great collaborator Andrzej Piątkowski, who made a script for this documentary, and directed by Leonid Martiniuk, who is now in the US. And that movie will be about Boris Nemtsov, about his life and events which unfortunately happened not long time ago. And with this in mind, I invite Andrzej to make a short introduction to this movie. Andrzej, are you ready to do it? And by Skype, we might have Leonid Martiniuk, if we will get him. I mean, nobody knows, how the services of the European Parliament sometimes work, but I hope we might manage with this. Andrzej.
Thank you, Petras. I don't want to anticipate the logic of this short documentary. It's better for you to see for themselves than listen to my description. And certainly, I think it provokes a lot of questions, and I'll be ready to answer it. I only want to clarify for the Western audience one line of intrigue at the very top of Russian power, which is not well known here. It's no secret in Russia that for years there were very serious split at the very top of Russian power about Chechnya and Kadyrov personality. Most of so-called silovikis, I mean FSB, the former KGB, and army and other institutions were not very happy, to say the least, with Kadyrov project. They, in their perception, Putin deprived them of so-called victory in Chechnya, giving too much power to Kadyrov. And this conflict exacerbated sharply during investigation of Nemtsov murder. And FSB especially, and its chairman Bortnikov, tried to use this investigation to accuse Kadyrov personally and to push Putin to sack Kadyrov and return Chechnya to their rule. And due to this conflict, they provide different section of Putin power, provide society with a lot of information about organization and organization of this crime. And you see it in the documentary, and later we'll be able to have discussion. Thank you. Chair of the movie, Leonid Martin.
Hello. before the watching documentary. Okay. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who helped to organize this presentation. I am grateful for this opportunity to show you our documentary, which is very important for me. Boris Nemtsov was my colleague and friend. He was a man whom I can rely on. I think it's a matter of honor not to forget and to seek justice, and I will. I used to work with Boris Nemtsov more than 5 years. During this time, we had written 2 reports about Putin's corruption and have produced more than 40 videos as part of our project, Lies of Putin's Regime. All these works and projects were based on open and verifiable sources of information available for the audiences. In Putin's Russia, it doesn't take an expert in some kind of secret knowledge in order to conduct political education of the people. To do this, first of all, you need courage. Courage to compare the available information and make a conclusion which no one else dares to do. That short documentary that you will see also was created on the same guideline of using only open and verifiable information. Moreover, it's basically the official information. This data is a result of criminal investigation which was carried out by Putin's investigators from the Federal Security Service, or FSB. Thank you. Don't worry. Okay. Thank you.